Greetings, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is David Sandalo. I'm the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And I'm really thrilled to just kick off tonight's event on women, energy, and economic empowerment. We have a fantastic group here. And thank you to everybody who helped organize it, and to Deloitte and our other sponsors. We couldn't have done this without you. Let me quickly say that, like all of the Center's events, this is being webcast live, and it will be podcast as well. For those of you who are watching on the web, you can ask questions using the hashtag CGEP events, that's Center on Global Energy Policy, CGEP events. And our Twitter handle is at Columbia U Energy. I've been working for many, many years on the clean energy revolution, as I know many people in this room have. And one thing that is for sure is that if we're going to have a revolution, we need all of humanity, not half of humanity, working on it. And I've seen so much over the course of my career how women in this field lack mentors, they lack support networks. And I'm sure those are some of the themes that are going to be discussed tonight. I don't think there's really anything more important than empowering women to work in this field. And it's one reason that it makes me so happy to introduce tonight my old friend, Rachel Kite, who is, Rachel is currently, and Rachel's our keynote speaker tonight. She's currently the CEO of SE for All and special representative of the UN Secretary General. She served until December of last year as the World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading the bank's effort for Paris and more broadly on climate change. She worked as a World Bank Vice President for Sustainable Development. She worked at IFC. She's won lots of awards, degrees from Tufts and the University of London, and we've had the pleasure of working together on a number of occasions. I can tell you that there is no one more effective in working on these issues in some very challenging environments sometimes than Rachel. So thank you, Rachel, for joining us, and appreciate you being here.
Good evening, everybody. David, thank you. Columbia is truly lucky to have you in this leadership position. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Bordoff, Jason Bordoff, who's a good colleague of SE for All, and to Kathy Chen, thank you very much, to the other students of Columbia University, alumni, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really pleased to be here. It's a topic that's very close to my heart, as well as a topic which is fundamental to the revolution that David referred to. We are going to talk tonight about energy, economic empowerment, women. Within the walls of the United Nations, that is a conversation about implementation of Sustainable Development Goals 5, 7, 9, 13 and 17. It's very dry. It's also a discussion about how to engineer an energy transition commensurate with the ambition of the Paris Agreement, and one that leaves no one behind. But tonight, I want to start by fast-forwarding to 2024. I want you to imagine that we're in 2024. It is the end of the United Nations decade for sustainable energy for all. And I want you to think about what is around you, what you can see, what you have experienced. So close your eyes. Imagine that we are in a village in Niger. We are in the Green Wall, the massive afforestation that has taken place to stop the Sahel moving around quite so violently. Every home in the village has solar power, connected to a microgrid run out of the community building. It's evening. All the cell phones are charging. Everything's transacted over the cell phone, from healthcare to education updates to banking to all other government services. The kids are studying. The clinic lights are on. There's an emergency C-section underway. The nurse in attendance smiles because she can remember as a trainee having to hold the torch between her teeth. She remembers praying that there would never be infections from the instruments when they were left in the autoclave, but the power went off. So now imagine that you're in Eastern Congo, a small town. There's refrigeration, keeping the newly arrived vaccines for the latest zoonotic disease outbreak fresh and ready for use. The improved communication that's come with the arrival of renewable energy helped women manage the seed selection over their phones and the time of their planting. And that meant that over the last couple of years, the yields have increased massively. The arrival of induction stoves over the last 3 years also gave them extraordinary bonuses in the amount of time that they had, which allowed them to do the things that they'd wanted to do 7 years ago, which was village by village, broker peace, women walking between villages to build the peace that Eastern Congo so desperately needed for the last 20 years. Now, keep your eyes closed, and we're in London. We're at the Institute of Directors. We're holding a meeting of energy sector firms. The audience are senior executives and board members, non-exec directs and others, of energy companies and energy services companies. The audience is predominantly women. Earlier in the day, they had met with the vice chancellors of the top 10 engineering schools in the UK. The outplacement rates for female graduates from engineering into energy companies is at an all-time high, something that none of these women, when they graduated, thought would ever happen. And now we're in Mexico. The minister's plane has just taken off and is fueled by bioenergy from food waste. The minister and her counterparts from Canada and the United States are working on the plane on the assessment of the North American Common Carbon Market's performance at the end of its first 4 years of operation. At this point, they're flying low over the Gulf of Mexico, over the flooded land behind Galveston Bay, and the floating solar farms that now power Houston. So you can open your eyes and see that these are pictures. These are pictures that I can easily paint of tomorrow, of 2024. But I can tell you stories today, vivid stories of success. The women in Nairobi who, using pay-as-you-go, can actually put that solar power system on their roof, take it down at night, who can actually begin to see an economic future for themselves and for their family. The 30% movement run out of London by Helena Morrissey, and the 2 Degrees of Change movement that we launched last week, together with Christiana Figueres, understanding that we need to get diversity on boards and that the energy sector needs it more than any other because it is the least diversified sector of the economy at the moment. The Clean Cook Stoves Alliance and others working to attack the piece of the puzzle which is moving the slowest because of population momentum and other factors. And the fact that for 2.9 billion people, the choice is cooked meal or poisoned air for your children. A Hobson's choice in 2016. But huge progress being made in building the markets for the appliances and the arrival of super efficient appliances offering real hope to many. And then there's power in a box for clinics, for emergency health services, small startups attracting equity and starting to change the way that the market is seen. So the question for us today is, how do we get from today to that tomorrow? Now, I have to leave before the panel finishes, and there'll be many on the panel who have real deep insight into how we need to do that. But I want to really talk about 4 things this evening. The first is that we have to front-load this goal. There's a tendency in the United Nations that, all countries are equal. That is true. Every country has a vote. All goals are equal, yes. But if we don't get access to sustainable, reliable, affordable, clean power, then we can only dream about reaching the goals around gender equality, around health, around education, and I could go on. For us to be able to front load this goal, realise the closing of the 1.1 billion gap of those who don't have access to electricity, the 2.9 billion gap for those who don't have access to clean cooking, then we need to have clear, consistent and coherent policy signals. At the international level, we've made big progress there last year, but also at the national level. What do I mean? I mean that the investments necessary in top-down and bottom-up power systems, energy systems. By top-down, I mean building out the grid, centralised power. From bottom-up, I mean decentralised solutions. Need to come from a policy framework which is agreed by all sides of the political aisle, that will withstand changes in minister, changes in government, changes in senior civil servant, changes in the interest rate. These are generational attempts at doing something that no country's done before. Not only closing the access gap, but doing it in such a way that brings us below 2 degrees as a collective international community. That requires consistent long-term signals that allow public investment to be made smartly and private investment to be attracted in. That means that countries have to work from a strong evidence base. Evidence of what works, evidence about what works fast, evidence of who really needs what kind of solution. We have to attack policy inconsistency. And we have to attack policy inconsistency where it in particular affects women. So the policy inconsistency at the macro level is a country that doesn't price carbon, doesn't insist that companies operating within its boundaries price carbon, that offers a harmful fossil fuel subsidy, and which then probably, still encourages the subsidising of banks to subsidise energy efficiency by firms. One of the areas of financial innovation we've seen the least innovation in, the financing of energy efficiency. So we just simply can't afford to want to go in one direction and have policy still dragging us in the other. But there are particular policy barriers that affect women. If 60% of those who don't have access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa are reliant upon bioenergy, carbon and charcoal, then we really have to unwind the carbon mafia. This is big business. This is big profitable business in cities across sub-Saharan Africa. It isn't just that we wish it away. We will have to actually undermine the economics of this in order to allow people to move to clean alternatives. So we need a policy environment that supports clean alternatives, and we need to then have the political will to deconstruct the business which already exists and which makes some very rich. We need access to finance for women. Women need to be able to access finance. The cell phone revolution has meant that many women now have, through their cell phone, an opportunity to build insurance and savings for themselves. But this is going to be absolutely important if they're going to take care of their families and if they're going to become entrepreneurs and economic actors. Women will have to be able to borrow, so insurance, savings and then credit. And that will be important in those countries which still really put prohibitive barriers in the way of women. The inability to collateralise movable assets, the inability to have title to land, etc. Still, 21 years after Beijing, a feature of the economy in too many parts of the world. So front-load the goals, put clear policy signals in place and attack those policies which really have a detrimental effect on women. Secondly, let's really attack the evidence base for why diverse teams make better risk-based decisions. We are asking ourselves to go on a journey of a transition of the energy sector that the globe has never seen before. We are going to have to assess risk differently going forward than we are today. And the work that's being done from the FSB, from Mark Carney and from others around the stranded asset risk that comes from an overdependence and over an exposure to carbon in the portfolios of long-term investors is fundamental in that education process. But there's long-term, longitudinal studies around the way in which diverse teams make better risk-based decisions from the University of Cambridge and others. We know that a group of men on their own will assess risk one way, a group of women on their own will assess risk another way, and if you put them together, you get risk assessments in a different way. If we want the revolution that David referred to at the beginning, we're going to have diverse teams running governments, running energy companies, running banks and financial services companies. And those diverse teams will have to be in the boardroom, will have to be in senior management, will have to be in middle management, and will have to be recruited out of universities. There is a real business case. There is a real risk-based evidence case for doing this. And in the energy sector, which has probably the greatest transition to manage its way through in the next 10 years, needs to be at the leadership of this. It is simply impossible to imagine that we can even begin to get onto the right road for 2030 unless we start to imagine an energy sector in 10 years' time which looks and feels very, very different from the one today. And there is a role for public policy and there is a role for political leadership in that, as well as a role for leadership at the boardroom and CEO level. There are energy companies who in the next few weeks will be coming out and telling us what their future holds for them. Most energy companies, whether they be utilities or locked into the fossil fuel economy, are doing desperate scenario work to understand where their business model will lead them. And of course, from Silicon Valley across the world, the fight for the brightest and the best is being fought by clean technology companies and those companies that see their future on the greener side of the equation. And they are winning. Third is this requires leadership. It requires political leaders at the highest level to put closing the energy access gap at the top of the agenda, where that is an issue. It requires political leaders to really be prepared to manage through a total government approach the energy transition that's needed. It requires leadership at the city level. It requires a generation of mayors that understand that efficiency within their town walls, the way in which the city's footprint on the rest of the economy operates will determine both the emissions profile but also the livability of that city and its competitiveness in attracting companies and jobs. It's leadership at the community level, leadership at the civil society level. We need to get going quickly. While we are focused in Sustainable Energy for All on the all, we need leadership to get there, and we need that leadership now. There's one area of leadership which really perplexes me, which is energy efficiency or energy productivity or the intensity of energy use. It's one of those behavioural issues where it's in your interest to be more efficient and the payback is almost immediate, yet we don't do it. Boardrooms and C-suites focus on profit, perhaps rather than on savings. We haven't seen innovation in energy efficiency finance in any marked way for probably 15 years. What would it take to make energy productivity sexy again? We can argue about really expensive installed power generation initiatives and the need for more and more power, or we can focus at the same time on becoming the most energy productive economy and therefore incredibly competitive. Why is one attractive and the other not? In an economy or a future economy where the more circular that we are, the better we will do. So for any of you, especially the students of Columbia, have answers to how to make energy productivity leadership sexy again and how to run for office on an energy productivity platform, I'd really like to hear from you. The fourth point I think is really important, and this is that the technology has advanced enormously. The cost of that technology is dropping like a stone. So it's policy and finance that need to catch up with what is technologically possible now. And it is not just a pipe dream to imagine that we can put the last mile first, that we can reach the furthest first. And that has a huge gender impact. If we can reach the most marginalised, the extended rural population, the peri-urban marginalised, if we can reach the women-owned households when the men are all in the city, if we can reach the disabled, if we can reach those who are discriminated against, and if they can, through new business models, have access to energy, we can truly start to think about leaving no one behind, and we can truly start to think about a sustainable energy for all. As I said, the technology has already got us halfway there, and now we need the policy, the finance, and the political commitment and leadership to get all the way there. So close your eyes and imagine that world. That is a world that we can build together. That is a world that the international community agreed to last year. And now the hard work begins in trying to help those countries build that need to make movement quickly, build the political will to actually start acting on this, and for the international community to be focused and disciplined enough to help countries to make this a 10-year generational shift rather than a 3-year project cycle. I'm optimistic. I can close my eyes. I have the great honour and privilege to work with the people who have brought about some of the revolutions that are already present today. Our job is simply to make this a worldwide revolution and to make it happen for women now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for sharing your insight and expertise into such an important topic, and for using the power of storytelling to really allow us to imagine what a sustainable energy future looks like. And this really reminds me of something that Rachel has once said, and which David Sandalow has alluded to earlier, actually. I quote, "We cannot solve the greatest challenge this generation faces if we only use half of humanity's ingenuity, strength, wisdom, and stamina." After hearing your speech tonight, Rachel, I think it's safe to say that you embody these characteristics and qualities that the other half of humanity has to offer. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And that brings us to tonight's topic of women, energy, and economic empowerment. Our panelists have joined us tonight to address an issue that affects all of humanity, and they have demonstrated incredible strength and wisdom to champion the use of energy to foster women's economic empowerment. My name is Kathy Chen, and I'm a graduate student at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. As the co-president of the SIPA Consulting Club and co-director of SIPA's Women in Energy program, I am honored to introduce your panel this evening. First off, we have Cheryl Wilson from Bloomberg Intelligence in Washington, D.C., who will be your panel moderator this evening. I think Cheryl has stepped out of the room. Sorry. Thank you, Cheryl. Next, we have Dr. Ellen Morris, professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and president and founder of Sustainable Energy Solutions. We also have Dr. Kate Steele joining us from USAID's Power Africa Initiative, and Dr. Kate Steele is the energy sector team lead. Richenda Van Leeuwen, who is the executive director at the UN Foundation's Energy Access Initiative. Kathleen Odell, senior manager of the Energy and Sustainability team at Deloitte Consulting. Dr. Minoru Takada, representative and director of the UN Sustainable Energy for All Initiative in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Cheryl to kick off our panel discussion. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Now you're live.
These things are always on a continuum. Okay, so thank you so much to Kathy for inviting me here. I graduated from SIPA about 6 years ago. It's surprising that it's been that long, but it's a real pleasure to be back and to be talking about energy with our really experienced and esteemed panel here today. So it's them that you'd like to hear from, but let me just sort of at a very high level sort of kick off our discussion. So I work in energy policy, in clean energy policy, mostly in the US, but I do have a global view. And this really is the time for us to be having this discussion. I have colleagues at Bloomberg who work on the Climate Scope Report, which looks at the investment climate for clean energy in emerging economies. And they found that in 2014, for the first time, the rate of growth of new clean energy deployment in emerging markets was 2 times that of OECD countries. So we are seeing massive growth. And in terms of integrating that with gender goals, this really is the perfect time to be discussing that. So I'm going to jump right in. And I would like to start with Ms. Odell, Kathleen, because I think your recent research has. Can I call you Kathleen? I think your recent research was sort of really the driving force behind tonight's theme. it's important, I think, to note, and you note in your report, that gender equality really has been a part of development goals for decades, for many decades. But your recent work has looked at sort of the untapped links between economic development and energy, and enabling women's sort of economic involvement in their communities. So I think maybe you can kind of give us a high-level view of how increasing energy access is taking down some of those barriers.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
It's great to
You should
be
also
here.
introduce yourself at the same time. I apologize.
Okay.
I think
Excellent.
I inadvertently skipped that portion of the program.
Sure. I'm Kathleen O'Dell. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a senior manager with Deloitte Consulting. Deloitte does all kinds of work around energy. We work with private sector clients in the clean technology sector. In that space, we work with power utilities that are looking to bring on more alternative energy. But my particular work is really around energy sector reform in emerging economies. So I work with international development organizations such as the UN, the World Bank, USAID, the State Department, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, who all have commitments to reducing poverty and increasing clean energy around the world. So my portfolio spans everything from developing a market for clean cook stoves in Bangladesh, to energy efficiency incentive mechanisms in Jordan, to looking at off-grid options in Ethiopia. So it can really span the globe and many areas. And what I'm really passionate about is the intersection of energy and economic opportunity. So I'm coming at it from that. How do you engage with the private sector, and how do you scale that so that it's really being truly an enabler of economic growth and opportunity? So I think getting back to your question, this was really an area I was particularly interested in, because in my work I found that most of those international development agencies were very interested in addressing gender issues, but it wasn't really being done in a meaningful way in the energy reform programs that I was seeing. So it was a little bit of a box checker, like let's count the number of women that go through the training program, but it didn't feel like we were really looking at it through what I would call a gender lens. So not just how do we check that box, but rather what opportunities could we be missing by not looking at it from that perspective? How can we actually enhance the impacts of our programs, not just get by with some kind of a training program? So to explore that more, we started doing some research. We did research both qualitatively, where we interviewed women working in the energy sector, or just how energy impacted their lives from many countries around the world, as well as looked at different data sets and studies quantitatively. And I found some very interesting aspects. I think the more this conversation is becoming very mainstream, it may not be such surprising findings anymore. I think Rachel touched on a lot of those aspects of economic empowerment that come, and there's kind of a nexus of productivity, so it's the time-saving aspects that comes from having that access. It's the labor force options that are then made available to you. And then it's the more indirect things, the things that impact health, that impact education. So things that we found, not only did women who had access to electricity, they were their income levels were 59 to 300% higher than those without. But then it was really interesting looking at how having that access to electricity had their girls 59% more likely to complete primary education than those without. So those were the kinds of things we looked at. I think I'll stop there, but
Maybe I can just ask a quick follow-up question. I thought you had a really interesting conclusion in your study that I think maybe gets to Rachel's point about sort of the urgency that we're facing and needing to front load some of these goals. You did find a bit of sort of a generational delay in sort of when you electrify a home, maybe you add solar lanterns. It very much helps, like you said, girls and other children with their education. But are you seeing or do you sort of have suggestions for sort of other development programs so that we can see impacts in the current generation and not sort of backload them towards the next generation?
Sure. I mean, I think you're seeing both.
Okay.
And so you want to acknowledge that there's an immediate impact when you put a solar home system on a rooftop. The ability to charge your cell phone, which is pervasive across all rural areas and around the world, to be able to do that right at home rather than have to travel multiple hours, pay a charging fee, leave your phone there, go back to get it again, same travel costs. And the productivity that comes with that is immediate and it's immense. And then having that access to that phone, I mean, Rachel painted a great picture of what that makes available. So those are really immediate. And then you really cannot discount the time saving that comes. I don't focus as much on the clean cooking aspect, but it's incredibly important, both from the health aspects, but also from the productivity that comes from the ability to provide, whether it's water and it's the ability to cook without having to go and collect firewood. Some of these very traditional ideas that we've been talking about for a while, but those are immediate impacts. And then you can see the generational comes later with access to a particular appliance, maybe having access to a television that now provides information in a way that was never made available before for that next generation. And of course, the lighting that provides the opportunity for education and the extension of a productive workday.
Wonderful, thank you. It's very exciting. I think at this point I will move on to Dr. Ellen Morris. Ellen, first I'll ask you to maybe take a minute or two and introduce yourself. But I think one of the themes that we heard from Rachel and also from Kathleen is that policy development is very important in sort of furthering these goals and knitting together these issues of women's sort of economic empowerment and access to energy. And you've done some interesting work with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and their Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, to sort of develop a policy framework, a model policy framework, to help those member states sort of systematically build gender considerations into their energy development programs. So it would be great if you could kind of tell us specifically some of the gender issues that can be knit into policy development. That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. So great to be here. Great to be with friends and new friends. And my name is Ellen Morris, and I teach at the Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. And my class is called Energy, Business, and Economic Development. It's one of the few courses, I think it's the only course at SIPA, that really focuses on the intersection of enterprise or businesses, technologies, and policy. So we really bring together in a balanced way the important issues around creating local businesses with a focus on cleaner technologies with the enabling policy framework. So I've been there since 2007 and have really just seen such an evolution of the students and the mindset over the years from something which was very unique and different, and now thankfully that kind of social enterprise creation, that kind of link to really making change on the ground with private sector, whether it's a small, tiny business or whether it's a large business linked to large investors. So that is my teaching hat. I also make it my business to really engage with students and do a lot of mentoring and guiding of students, specifically women students. So I'm the faculty advisor for the Women in Energy program at SIPA, the Women's International Leadership program at Columbia more broadly. So I like to really help young students and young women in particular figure out what this crazy convoluted path is that probably every one of us could tell, so that you don't feel so constrained with how am I going to jump to that career goal that I have, when you just sort of have to build it incrementally, let things land in your lap, let opportunities come and be open to those opportunities. Because I think everyone in this panel, I think it's fair to say, probably has a similar trajectory. In addition to that, I do a lot of consulting work with my consulting company that's been around since 1996. starting with work at United Nations Development Program, working with Minoro and others at UNDP to really launch my career in energy and development. So I've done a lot of work on in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, with all sorts of different clients, from the multilaterals to private sector developers. And so it's been a whirlwind, and every new assignment is even more interesting than the next. And most recently, I've done some work on gender and energy, which is what brings me to this particular panel today. And the work that we did with the Economic Community of West African States, which is 15 countries in West Africa, it's a regional body, a regional political body that works on everything from energy, water, human rights, gender, and in this particular case, ECOWAS and the ECOWAS Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Program, which was launched in 2010 by Mahama Kapia. They built a gender and energy program under that umbrella in 2013. So it's not been a long track record in terms of the renewable energy and energy efficiency mandate of ECOWAS. However, I can't stress enough, and it sort of builds on what Rachel said, is this political will and this commitment to really drive change from the policy, from the regional perspective. And so really with sort of, I think, a very charismatic leader at the head of the renewable energy and energy efficiency, we were able to develop the first ever gender mainstreaming policy for energy access. So it's the first in the world. It's really out there in front of really everybody else to bring together 15 countries in a fairly seamless and quick fashion, because the project, in terms of the research to really understand what the issues were in each of the countries. So we spent a lot of time because we looked at it from the energy side. So we went into the energy ministries and the energy stakeholders, from civil society to private sector, to really figure out what was going on in the energy sector vis-a-vis gender, to try to catalog and create some metrics for what was happening. So we started that in January of last year, and by June, the policy was validated by the ministries of energies in all 15 countries. And so I would say, coming from the US, and seeing how slow policy moves in this country, that it was truly amazing. And I never would have imagined in January when we started it that we would actually have closure of the adoption of the policy in June. So this policy really looks at all of the things that I think Rachel touched on so nicely, and it's really awesome to have someone in her role to really also validate what this policy is all about, which is around, I won't go into detail, but it's things around creating opportunities for women and girls in energy technology businesses or technical fields. It's around creating enabling environments for businesses clean energy businesses to thrive. Again, for women and men. So I appreciate that Minoro is here and there are men in the audience, because gender is not just about women. It's about giving equal opportunity to men and women. So this policy is very forward-looking on both the training and capacity of the policymakers in these countries, as well as on the receiving end, these people in very far-flung rural areas starting for the first time to have a voice and have a way to access clean energy through either small enterprise development or very proactive policies to make sure that these groups are around the table, and more specifically that women and men are around the table to drive that policy. So, that's really what the ECOWAS gender mainstreaming for energy access policy is about. Now the next step of this is to create model legislation around the policy. And so ECOWAS and myself, and we also are getting some legal experts, because I'm definitely can't, I've done a lot of things, but law is not one of those things I could ever do. So we're assembling a team now with legal expertise to really develop that model legislation for countries who have all come together and said, yes, we sign on to this policy. Yes, we sign on to these targets for 2020 and 2030 to meet the benchmarks, but we need to change our own national policies to be able to, and national legislation to be able to do that. So the way, 15 countries are very heterogeneous and different. So some are really out there in front of the group, and some are sort of watching what happens from the sidelines. So we're hoping that those countries which are really leading by example will bring others from the region forward, as well as serve as a model for the world. So that legislation is now in the process of, we actually haven't started it because I've been involved with other projects, but that will be underway soon and be finished by this year. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think one of the, particularly you being a professor, I think one of the the interesting parts that I've sort of read through the model framework is the focus on sort of ingraining these issues we're talking about sort of throughout the whole process. So from planning and education all the way through deployment. I'm curious if within that framework there's any carve out for getting women specifically involved in the industry itself. So not just benefiting from economic empowerment from the energy access, but also working in the industry, in various parts of the industry. Is there any consideration to that?
Yeah, I mean, the workforce issues and the workforce creation, I think, are very important. I mean, it's important in this country as well. We have very limited representation. I mean, the numbers of women who are in the STEM, the science and technology fields, is still really limited. And so in developing countries and developing countries in West Africa in particular, those numbers are even smaller, but just because the education for both boys and girls is not necessarily that robust in that area. So the key there, I think, is making boys and girls feel well trained on technical issues, business issues, management issues, and combining that education then if there are businesses to be created or working at a company to create sort of chains for access to finance. And that's where we see, and Rachel talked about this as well, and that access to finance is hugely important because these people who may be local entrepreneurs typically don't have access to commercial finance like we would in Europe or in the US. That finance has to come on different, more flexible terms. And so if you are an energy entrepreneur, that kind of financing is hugely important. And I think women in particular have a difficulty presenting themselves to access that finance, or even having the confidence to do that and the skills to really speak to investors. So I think, yes, women can be, and women and men definitely benefit from clean energy services at the household and the business level. But I think we're also seeing, obviously, the potential for the people to be either driving change through policy, driving change through creating businesses, driving change through education. So I think all of those things are important. And I think this ECOWAS policy is so forward-looking because it touches on all of those things.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I think the type of policy program that you've been describing is really important to reaching the Sustainable Energy for All, or SE for All, goals. So I think this would be a good transition over to Dr. Minoru Takata. I would also invite you to take a minute and just tell us about sort of your role within SE for All. And then I think it would be helpful for us to understand what steps within that framework, because SE for All works with stakeholders across the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. I think perhaps with Paris, the Paris agreements being signed this week, I have governments on the mind. It'd be interesting to hear from you how governments that you're interacting with within SE for All are considering this issue. And then if we have time, I'll have a follow-up question on whether we need new technology to meet SE for All goals. Let me pass it to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Minoru Takada. I have been working on sustainable energy from the beginning, 2011, and having worked within the United Nations in the Executive Office of Secretary General. So initial couple of years, we had one very important thing to achieve, which is that making sure that energy stays at the top of the global agenda, so which is realized now as part of being Sustainable Development Goal. You know that 17 goals, and number 7, it's a new goal, which is the first time United Nations agreed globally to establish goals and targets. So I think this is a very good sort of movement happening. I hope that everybody will be able to utilize this opportunity to kickstart sort of, great action moving forward on that. Obviously, this comes at the time when there is an agreement on the climate. So this is going to be in the context of Paris Agreement. So there's going to be additional sort of impetus and opportunities to work on those things. I started my career immediately after sort of graduating from the Japanese university, working on nuclear engineering. And I went into the village in Ghana as a volunteer. It's like a Peace Corps type arrangement in Japan, and where there was no electricity, no pipe water. So I was reading sort of newspapers on and under the lantern, listening radio, BBC Sports News to just understand English, and then also on getting the water, which is carried by my students, mainly women, who actually carry water either from the river or well, or sometimes rainwater from the roof. So I got sort of firsthand sort of how sort of really women and children are burdened. Because I give my assignments, and I have been teaching over there as a secondary school teacher. And then I give assignment, okay, you do it by tomorrow morning, A, B, C, D. But then I realize that immediately after they go home, what they have to do, they go and fetch water. And they have to start cleaning up and cook. Only then can they actually come back and start studying, including my homework, under the lantern. At that time, unfortunately, we did not have technology that is affordable enough to give it to them, or they can afford. So it was always lantern, and then it is a really sort of limited means for them to study. So that triggered me, wow, nuclear engineering is interesting, maybe I should change the course a little bit. So that's how I get into sort of, these sort of businesses of linkages, energy, and development on that. Now, coming back to sort of your questions on those things. So governments now agreed on the overall global framework. We have energy goal targets. We have Paris. What do we do on this one? And for us to be able to sort of produce accelerated actions, bureaucracy will really have to transact this sort of global movement. So transaction is very important because otherwise it will stay paper. Mm-hmm. Right? So can we actually create kind of sort of national targets and specific sort of really sort of benchmarks that are disaggregated through the sex, so women and men a little bit. Why do I say so? Because I think last sort of decades, international community with the government really sort of, talked about women, energy, gender all the time on that. That practically resulted in one thing, many projects. It's nice to have, on the cookstove projects, nice to have solar home system, nice to have a training program, capacity building, checkbox, on those. That's nice. And I think we sort of measured, okay, 10 villages and people empowered, A, B, C, D, F, G. That's fine on that one. I don't think that is sufficient anymore. Mm-hmm. And we have an opportunity here because, as you said, there's evidence here. If you do it well, you can actually change your life, short-term and long-term. There's a willingness by leadership, Ellen mentioned in ECOWAS, they're trying to even think about legislation. And even better, there's a means that is getting there. Rachel mentioned the technologies are getting more and more affordable, available on those things. If we combine all those things, I think leadership should be able to create kind of target that is making them explicit in terms of their commitments. We are going to provide X or achieve Y, which directly impact women, not just implicitly, including women X percentage Y type thing. I think we have come to the point because I think we have shied away for a long time staying at the efficiency level approach, right? So which is what gender called, efficiency-based approach. I think inequality, equity, we can put it sort of at the center right now. Then we can say women and men, for us to be able to sort of empower both, get to the equal society, we should be able to achieve both. I invite all of you to look at Human Development Report of 2015, so the work for human development. That's sort of disaggregated sort of current status vis-a-vis employment status for men and women. How many people in the senior management to the sort of equal opportunity for men and women, almost across the board, women are really disadvantaged. I don't think we can actually sort of continue like this for a long time. I think we can start from the energy sector, disaggregating it and put specific sort of milestones, benchmarks, and we can start measuring it. Just one example here, this is sort of what we call global tracking framework. Last 3 years, we started sort of, on the looking at data and making progress across 190 countries. How much progress we are making on access, renewable, and energy efficiency, which are sort of SDG 7 targets for energy. I think we can disaggregate this one along the line of, gender, and go deeper. Legislation, businesses, institutions, capacities, training to education, all those things, and starting putting sort of numbers here. I think we can start working on it, because if you just leave it to the governments, it will take 20 years. So this one, we didn't do it with the governments. We started doing it with the international sort of organization, like-minded partner to do it. Now it is being mainstreamed into the SDG indicators discussions. I think we can start now together to work on this disaggregated thing. There's a national review of SDG that is about to be happening starting from this year. It is a voluntary process. This year, 22 governments are going to produce national voluntary review reports on how much they're going to be progressing toward SDGs or intend to progress toward SDGs, because this is the beginning of the year. This is going to come more. I think in conjunction with that, if group of people, organization like Columbia University start jumping into it, pick up one country, start sort of doing disaggregated sort of analysis, maybe focused on SDG 7 to start with. That will have a significant impact. So I think this is a kind of thing that we could do, and it's really a sort of opportunistic moment to be able to do and change the ball game. But I again stress that no more concept, no more only projects. Really, we have to benchmark it. And then if we create sort of data set and transparency and keep track of those things, I think we can actually help them make progress much faster.
That's fascinating and very optimistic. I'd be curious, in a good way, I'd be curious to know whether you or your discussions within SE for All and maybe at Paris as well, if you ever view, so we've been talking about energy access as empowering women, but what about if you flip that? What about if we look at encouraging energy programs from the perspective of this will help women? Is that something that you think about, that you talk about, within SE for All? Do people kind of view it that way? Like, does it help convince governments maybe or other actors to move faster because of these additional benefits?
I think it's a very important point, like sort of Rachel mentioned. I think if we pick sort of one of the targets, definitely I think we must sort of emphasize that getting access to everybody of electricity and clean cooking solution is going to be the most important targets among the three. And it has to be advanced much faster on those things. And given the advancement of the technology options at this point in time, we could encourage and work with the governments and other partners to sort of specifically tailor those programs that will benefit sort of last mile first. And that immediately would have a knock-on effect on the gender. And I think that sort of, right now, looking at the situation now over the last couple of years only, I think, solar lighting program in off-grid situations over there, market in Africa and Asia, I think, report says that 15 times increase just the last 3 years only. An enormous number of sort of business entrepreneurs popping up. I think if we could capitalize on those kind of momentum and work with the governments to start pushing on that, I'm quite optimistic the next 5 years we can make a lot of advancement on those things. And those things that, yes, exact priorities of the Sustainable Energy Program.
Okay, thank you. I think this would be a good spot to pivot a little bit and move to Dr. Kate Steele. So again, I will ask you to give us a bit of your background. And your background is interesting, I think, because you've sort of worked both with Power Africa in the public sector, but also in the private sector. So I would ask you to discuss with us whether you see any significantly different approaches being used in the public sector versus the private sector, whether you think that we all hear that the private sector can move faster, but are you seeing that kind of outcome, or did you in your previous work?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to turn it around a little bit and use answering the question to do my personal introduction, but then roll that into introducing Power Africa, because I realize that may not be an organization that everyone in the room is really familiar with. So in thinking through my transition from, you all have my bio in the brochure, but I went from the World Bank to Google to Power Africa. And so when I started at the World Bank, it was really with the intention that if the bank could get it right, they have lots of resources, they have lots of influence, that they really could be an agent for change in energy access. They have the ear of the government in most places. They have a lot of financial resources they can put, and they have a lot of knowledge resources. I think that the knowledge bank is not to be underestimated. And I think that that's still true. I think they are having a lot of impact, particularly on large-scale projects, particularly on grid extension, but also on what I ended up getting involved in, which was the Lighting Africa program. And so Lighting Africa is a program that was started actually with a lot of input from people who are here, but to really catalyze the market for off-grid lighting in Africa. It's now lighting global, it's now worldwide, but it was really looking at trying to bring these solar lanterns, exactly as you said, the technology wasn't quite there, the market wasn't quite there, but started to see a trend where you could get lower cost products into the hands of people that were previously using kerosene to study at night. So it's through the Lighting Africa program that I really started to have a lot of interaction with the private sector, because this is really dominated by startup companies that are seeing the opportunity and are starting businesses to supply off-grid products. And so from that, I was thinking, well, this is really, the momentum is on the private sector side. There's a lot happening here, and had started having conversations with Google about what they could do in energy access. And of course, Google has enormous resources. It's another a place that can have a lot of impact. And so those conversations rolled into me actually transitioning over to Google and wanting to see what I could do from the private sector perspective. And the fact that I came back in 2 years doesn't mean that there's not a huge role for the private sector. The private sector can move a lot faster. They can really be putting a lot of resources and ingenuity behind solving energy access. But what I realize is that it's still a pretty tough road for a lot of private sector companies, that if we look at the startups that were coming into Lighting Africa, a lot of them were fighting for money initially. They were getting a lot of smaller grants and winning business competitions and things like that. They were starting to get some smaller equity investments, but it felt like it was always kind of pulling the money to get the projects up and running. And I think that what I found is there was still a really significant role for the public sector. And I felt that there was still this need for an organization that was really going to try and raise all boats. And so that's what prompted me to transition back to the public sector and back to Power Africa. Power Africa was kind of launching as I was at Google, and ended up having meetings with Power Africa from Google and starting to talk to them about what they could be doing, and then rolled over into Power Africa. And really at the core of Power Africa, their goal is to bring in that private sector investment. That's why it was a really good transition. That Power Africa was launched in June of 2013, so we're coming up on 3 years now. It was launched by President Obama. It's a presidential initiative. And it's really, the focus of it is trying to double access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. And really from an economic growth perspective, I think we're talking about a lot of bottom-up opportunities in access, but there's also a big top-down push that there needs to be a lot of power coming in for economic productivity at the commercial industrial level, but also just getting power out to more households from a central grid as well. So that was the premise of it, but it was really also rooted in partnership and investment. So it's 12 US government agencies working together, along with a whole host of development partners and over 100 private sector partners. And that, as well as working very closely with African governments, because what we were trying to do was take this very transaction-oriented approach. So not necessarily trying to create this perfect energy sector and trying to create the absolutely perfect enabling environment or the perfect project, but really look at what were the key bottlenecks. And so looking at projects that have been in the pipeline for years and what was holding them back, why were they not getting over the finish line, and what could we do to help them get over the finish line, and how could we bring all the resources of the US government as well as the resources of our partners and the private sector to make that happen. And so that's how we've continued to try and operate, is really focusing on what we can do to get that investment in. And really the two levers we have to pull on that are making it more attractive to the private sector. So figuring out ways to mitigate risks. There's a lot of perception of risk. There's some actual risks as well in investing in energy projects, but there's also a lot of perception of risk. So how do you make it easier for companies to come in? The other side of that is we can work on the enabling environment and try and make it more conducive to investment in countries. And some of that's technical assistance, some of it can be legal assistance, capacity building, those sort of things. But those are really the two sides that we're working from. And just our top line goals, we're trying to enable or facilitate 30,000 new megawatts of power and 60 million new connections. We aligned with Sustainable Energy for All, and we're trying to achieve that by 2030. That doesn't mean that we're not also advocating for universal access. We absolutely are. We just see that as our contribution. And fairly recently, we've outlined more specifically our strategy on, I'll focus on the access side of that, which is we see this as being both grid and off-grid. There are absolutely places that should have grid connections. Urban areas, if you're in a dense urban area, you should have a grid connection. It's economically viable. If you're pretty close into the grid, then it's probably pretty reasonable to connect those households and businesses to the grid as well. But there's a vast opportunity for off-grid as well. And so in our roadmap that we published in January that lays out our targets, we talk about half and half. So it's 35 to 40 million of the connections coming from grid sources and 25 to 30 million coming from off-grid sources. But that we'll really have a focus on both of those, ideally with a lot of integrated planning around that. Pulling this back to gender really quickly, because we are relatively new, so we're coming up on 3 years. We're just starting we do have a gender strategy that we're integrating. We would love to be doing more tracking of the impacts of electrification that some of the other panelists are doing. I think that is all coming up. The one thing we have launched, though, that is in the gender category is the Women in African Power. And it's funny, Rachel and I were meeting with Rachel's predecessor, Kande Mkela, several months ago, and we were talking about women in African power. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, this must be your idea," because I'm a woman at Power Africa. And it's actually completely not. It's the head of Power Africa, Andy Herskowitz, was looking around the room at a number of his meetings and realized that of the U.S. government partners, the head of USTDA, the head of OPIC, the head of USAID, the head of MCC, as well as the Secretary of Commerce, are all women. And so this is really the driving force behind a lot of Power Africa. And same thing, he lives in Pretoria, was sitting in business meetings with investors and bankers as well as practitioners and realized that a lot of them were women. And he was asking me, like, hey, you guys should be all talking to each other. So the Women in African Power isn't really about programming for gender. It's about getting women who are working in African power together and really as a professional development and mentoring opportunity. This is also fairly new. But you should look up we have a LinkedIn group. And we are starting to put together events around a lot of the big energy conferences and other things. And I know Rashinda's going to talk about C3, so I won't link that to that. But I think I'll close with that.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm going to return to your point, particularly about centralized power versus off-grid in a minute. But I wanted to transition over to Rashinda, Ms. Van Leeuwen. I think that one of the things we've been hearing here is that the development of electrification in rural areas it's off-grid, and there's a lot of development in women-run businesses and small enterprises in that space. And I know that you've got extensive experience developing market solutions for off-grid clean energy projects. So I was wondering if you could speak, and we can start here. Maybe you can speak to some of the unique barriers or challenges to developing sort of these small-scale off-grid or maybe microgrid types of projects, in addition to giving us your background and introduction.
Oh, thank you very much. And forgive me if my voice gives out. I hope it will hold out this evening. It's about 2 octaves lower than it normally is tonight. But so just by way, since everybody else has given their backgrounds, I'm the person on the panel who shows that you don't actually have to have a doctorate to be in this sector, but you can do this with an MBA as well. My own background, just a very snapshot, is I spent many years working on economic development issues, actually helping women who, among the poorest of the poor, start micro and small enterprises. And at that time, there wasn't a specific focus on energy, but in Haiti, where I was working, leading a New York-based NGO called Trickle Up at the time, the only business that a woman could start and make a profit the same day was actually in selling charcoal. And so we had the choice at that time as an NGO with deciding, because we were all about women choosing how they were going to go into business. They made the determination about what kind of business that they wanted to operate. So we had the choice between, do we support this woman to actually start her business, which is selling charcoal, which is really, really bad. If you know anything about Haiti, it's almost completely deforested. Or does she get to feed her family that day? So I wasn't working on energy issues specifically at that time, but that stayed with me ever since. So fast forward to 10 years ago, through one of the quirks of careers, I ended up going into venture capital in commercial renewable energy investing in emerging markets, which trying to set up a renewable energy fund in Africa at that time was an exercise in futility because nobody was interested. But I also had a fabulous job working on energy access and doing a lot of financing, both through commercial as well as impact investing on energy access projects. Fast forward, I brought that into my work with the United Nations Foundation, where I was able to, for the last 6 years, focus working with Minoru and Ellen and others, Kate and others, really looking at both the confluence between the policy aspects of energy access and also the market component, and really building up a network of what's now 2,300 energy entrepreneurs who are delivering energy services in the developing world. And what I do want to say about that in terms of the sort of the gender aspect is there's not enough women yet leading those enterprises. So I don't know if those of you in the audience, are any of you actually thinking of starting your own business? Any entrepreneurs out there? 1, 2, maybe 3. I hope some of you will consider it, because we actually need more women starting their own businesses. A lot of the known names now in energy access, particularly in the solar lantern side, like D-Light and some of the others, used to knock on my door when I was in venture capital. So I saw all of these guys starting out. So I've had a really kind of unique perspective of seeing how they've all evolved. And I have to say, behind the scenes, I've actually held a lot of their feet to the fire, because one of the things that we find is there's not so many women in venture investment. Even today, it's improving generationally, but it's the investors who put their people on the boards. So if the investors are all men, then the people on the boards are all men as well. So if you have the men, and forgive me because I know this is gender and it's women and men, but let me finish my story. And then you find that also, because there are invisible biases, that it tends to be the senior management look like the investors in the board as well. So I was finding that we were seeing this sort of generational continuation with not enough women. So behind the scenes, they still talk to me, fortunately, but I've actually held a lot of the feet of the guys to the fire, because a lot of these companies are saying, well, our mission is to help solve energy access. And, in that we recognize that women are particularly disadvantaged and we need to help women. And I say, guys, behind the scenes, look, I look at your board, no women. I look at your senior management, no women. And your mission is helping women. You've been able to get away with it, but somehow I don't think that's going to fly in the future. So just to say that sometimes we need to be outspoken about this. Sometimes we need to be outspoken behind the scenes. And to be fair, I got an email 2 years ago from one of them. I'm not going to name the company. And they said, Rachenda, we've got a woman now. I said, okay, well, that's great. It's kind of 8 years late, but better late than never. So anyway, so what I'm really saying here is it's all about the whole ecosystem. Absolutely. Some of the others have Rachel at a start and some of the other panelists have made some great points about how women benefit from having access to power in their homes. I would also say that, and maybe this is the question you're going to ask me, so forgive me if I'm preempting it, but it's also in the communities, and maybe I'll come back to that in a second. It's about business, but it's also about looking at what is something that the private sector can deliver versus where we need public sector goods as well. The other initiative that Ellen and I are both honored to be involved with is the C3 initiative that Kate just mentioned as well, which is a US initiative actually inspired by David Sandlow when he was at the US Department of Energy, which is focused on mentoring women to work in the clean energy sector. It's called C3E. It's Clean Energy Education and Empowerment. And Ellen and I both serve as women clean energy ambassadors, highfalutin title. But really, it's about trying to get women, young women, particularly those who've gone into STEM subjects, studied them, getting them to come into the sector and then stay and make their careers in the sector as well. It's been fascinating. There's just amazing women here across the US working on just a ton of different types of clean energy issues, from research to policy to funding. And a number of them are making their careers in the international sector as well. But we need more women entrepreneurs, because one of the things that we do find is that women, the policy changes not only because there are women helping to change the policy, but when you actually have the entrepreneurs who are themselves talking and requiring that change, that voice counts as well. So we don't have sort of targeted financing for women. It is harder for women to often to get the access to financing to start their business, or to get it through the valley of death, or to really grow it. It's not easy, but we have some really strong women out there who are pushing, and we just need more of them really to help to push that further, faster. And as I say, you know, half the market is women, so we need half of the people delivering the solutions to be women as well. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just add a follow-up to the C3E?
Please, absolutely.
Just as a short plug, tomorrow at the Javits Center, there's going to be a clean C3E panel as part of the Advanced Energy Conference, which is a huge US-based focused across all sectors energy event happening at the Javits Center. But tomorrow from 2 to 5, there'll be a specific C3E panel with other C3E ambassadors focused on their work they're doing in the New York area. So it should be a very interesting event. And thanks for introducing the C3E, because I think we'll continue on the discussion tomorrow.
Thank you. I have a similar experience. I'm in a slightly different part of the energy industry, more on the research and data provision side. But the very first professional conference that I attended, working with Bloomberg, I was sitting on a panel and I was discussing pollution control technologies for power plants and sort of the market around that. And not only was I the only female on the panel, I was one of 3 females in the room, about 150 people. And it was such a surprising moment, I think coming from academics, where I had always felt things were a little bit more balanced, to going out into the workplace, it was quite a shock. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here 6 years later in this capacity. Before we open up to the floor for questions, and I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask questions here in the room. We will have a microphone around. But as was mentioned at the beginning, you're also feel free to tweet to the Columbia Energy Center and we can pick those up as well. But I wanted to pose a question that I think maybe everyone might be able to contribute to. And this is bent a little bit more towards my work. I work on US policy. But I think one of the things that we think about a lot in energy development, not only in the US, but also globally, and particularly in emerging markets, is sort of this balance between what will be built at a centralized level and what will be sort of decentralized. Now, in the US, decentralized doesn't necessarily mean off-grid, and the implications of that, I think, are different in emerging economies. But I'd be curious, maybe we can start with Dr. Steele, because I think you mentioned this. Are there differences in impact, you think, to women? All these things we've discussed about women's empowerment. Are there differences whether a region or government chooses to go a centralized route, or whether it's decentralized projects that are built? Is that something that kind of you see come up?
I think it makes a big difference, but the difference is on affordability, which I think impacts all people. I think it affects women more than it affects maybe male-headed households. But really, it's kind of an unfortunate dichotomy, because I think that there's gotten to be this very grid versus off-grid as far as the communities of practice. And really what's needed is both. And I think that there is a case to be made for where you want grid access and where you want that high-powered supply, for if it is for commercial industrial purposes, or if it is going to be a high-consuming household. And I think there's a great space for for off-grid in areas where it's going to be far more affordable and where you can finance a system and be essentially disconnected from the grid but have all the same services after you've paid it off. And I think what I'd like to see is more of a shift towards the service that can be provided by the system. Because I think that there's been a feeling that, well, grid is real power and you can use real power for real things. And off-grid is an interim step or something that really doesn't have as high a level of service. But there's plenty of grid connections that only have power 4 hours a day and are only powering a light bulb and a cell phone charger because that's what the household can afford with the grid tariffs. And there's plenty of off-grid systems now in the past few years where households have a TV and multiple lights and radios and starting to get into even more and more appliances that are coming out. And so I think really thinking about what the services are and what the services could offer. And I think where we've heard some of the ones that affect women are getting into better and better lighting, getting lighting at multiple light points, so it's not just one person who has it. But I think when we start to get into some of the technologies that will impact cooking and water purification, I think that that's going to also have a significant impact. And whether that's highly efficient on-grid appliances or highly efficient off-grid appliances, it doesn't really make much difference.
I'd like to answer that because I think actually you skipped over my question, which I wanted to answer because I think Kate's absolutely right. But where there is a huge impact is, and it's not the binary on-grid or off-grid, but is in the healthcare sector. One of the things that we're seeing where there is really this global public good, the private sector cannot yet deliver these solutions sustainably, is in healthcare settings. Women should not have to be told to bring a candle to the health clinic so that there is light for the midwife to see by to help them when they're delivering their baby. That is happening too much in too many countries still, in too many clinics. We are seeing that there is still in the sector when there are projects happening, and I'm not going to name names, but unfortunately some of the big well-known names are thinking that somehow it's sufficient to have a solar-powered vaccine refrigerator in the clinic, which is great, which the vaccines need to be kept cold, and the woman next door in the next room over in the clinic is giving birth without any lighting whatsoever. Or midwives who I've seen, one in Liberia, told me, well, I was using my cell phone to hold it up here while I'm helping to deliver the baby. And I said, okay, well, that must have been difficult. She said, well, I only had one hand to deliver the baby. So this is something where we have the opportunity to make a change. It's not sufficient for us to say that actually just having a couple of lights is enough for the clinic. There is a real gender element here, and it is a woman gender element here, which is a woman isn't even feeling safe to go to the clinic if there isn't the proper lighting outside, so she feels safe to go there in the evening. Making sure that where she's delivering that at a basic minimum there is light. I mean, let alone the other energy-dependent health services that are needed for newborns. Infant mortality, neonatal and maternal mortality are still really high in those countries with low levels of electrification. Although the World Health Organization doesn't have the data to say there's a definitive correlation, I think those of us who work on the ground in the sector recognize that it's no coincidence. So it's not so much about grid or off-grid, it's about quality of power, it's about holistic power, it's about sustainability of the solution sets, and it's also about design. We've just, at UN Foundation, recently put out an RFP for health clinic electrification. And we put in very, very specific design components, and it was amazing. Great response to it. But it was kind of unusual because people were not used to actually seeing specifics that talked about gender design in a health facility electrification project. So it's just one thing also is looking back at how we structure these RFPs that go out, how we structure these calls for proposal for financing. It's not just about what the solutions are, but how we are actually delivering the calls for those solutions as well.
I have a feeling that has probably brought about some questions from our audience. Do we have anyone coming forward with any questions for our panel? Don't be shy. Thank you.
Hello. Firstly, thank you so much. It's such a nice pleasure to see such an inspiring panel, both led by amazing men and women. Yeah, it's like important to respect every gender. Firstly, I would like to give a personal comment. It's very inspiring to see women in the space, both in the energy and policy as well as financing. I speaking myself as working in the private equity sector, in a firm focusing on renewable energy growth, as well as infrastructure company in the renewable space. And I'm also working aside within the Global Commission on Pollution, Health and Development. And I just want to mention a quick word about that because this is another reason which can be also raised while discussing with investors, which is, as it has been mentioned already, it's health. The health impacts are critical. Pollution is really an overlooked issue, and there's really high correlation between fossil fuel energy, pollution, and health. 1 people out of 7 is dying because of pollution, and I just want to mention that the work of this commission, which is actually coordinated by the World Bank and UNEP, is going to be soon released at the end of the year in the Lancet. But I just want to mention that because it can be something as well which might be useful in your discussion in the future, because it's going to be the first time ever that the cost of every type of pollution, both water, air, and soil, impact on health are going to be economically assessed. So I just wanted to mention that. And the other aspect is on the policy side. As working in the private sector, and really engaged towards sustainability, financing sustainable development, policy and the public sector is key, but the amount of capital is not sufficient to drive those goals. But in the same time, when you look at investors, I recently was in the PRI 10 years anniversary. There are many people there who are really committed to drive those changes, but you need to have the economy behind. So my question is how policymakers can help the economics to be there as well, to help people in the finance sector, but as well entrepreneurs, to really make those change happen, because we need to work and collaborate to really make those change happen. So yes, here's my question.
Would anyone like to field that one?
We're kind of in Power Africa is in the middle of private sector and public sector, so I think I can at least answer part of that. And I think that the policymakers do have a large role to play. That I think because you see, exactly as you said, there's not enough capital coming from the public institutions. It has to come from the private sector. That the McKinsey's Brighter Africa report that came out last year said the price tag for universal access in Africa, the whole system, is $835 billion. And it's probably not going to come from the development banks or from bilateral government development partners. It is going to come from private sector. And I think what we're seeing is not an absence of capital, but an absence of bankable projects. And so then you start to look at what are the things that are making projects less bankable. And maybe it's that there's difficulties with the off-taker, the utility is going to purchase the power. Maybe there's not cost-reflective tariffs. Some of those are policy issues, that how do you set get the utility in a place that it is commercially viable and therefore is attractive for an investor to sell power to them. Another one that we're seeing that Rashen's been looking a lot at is the microgrid sector. So you need to have a regulatory framework that allows for microgrids. That I think you have a lot of the startups that are saying, well, we have 10 systems that are up and running and we're kind of under the radar. You're not going to get to 10,000 systems under the radar. So you need to be planning for a regulatory framework that knows what to do when the grid meets a microgrid, or has a policy for how you set the tariff for a microgrid. All of those are on the policy regulatory side, but are what are going to enable the private sector investment.
And I think also, and just to add to that, I think one of the things we've seen over the course of time really is that thinking about how donors allocate their funds, because there's a lot of well-meaning donors which want to sort of give systems away, and I think that goes against sort of the the sort of economic development principles of basically helping the market thrive. Because you can imagine if the private sector is in there and they think the rules are a certain way in terms of allowing them to be a part of the game in that country to sort of sell and service products, if there is a donor or a multilateral group that sort of dumps product in there as a sort of free charitable thing, it's a good thing that they want to do that, but it needs to be channeled in such a way. And I think the public sector and the policy has to be in line with allowing that kind of capital to come in, but used in a smart way so that it doesn't put the private sector at risk, which is taking a risk to be in there, to be honest. And so I think that's another sort of facet of that issue.
Yeah, and there's just been, there's a lot of other issues going on as well, not all of which need a policy fix, but some of them need a financing fix. Some of the financing tools, for example, some of the companies in East Africa last year struggled because of a lot of currency fluctuations. So the small companies, for those of you in finance, hedging is expensive. As a larger company, you can afford it. As a smaller company, it's difficult. I wouldn't yet say that all of the financing tools are built out yet for this energy access sector. There still needs to be some work to do. Some of it's a policy fix. Some of it is actually developing some of the aggregate tools that can help to de-risk some of the issues, particularly for the earlier stage and smaller companies in the sector as well.
I think, and thank you so, about pollution and the economic cost of it. And just looking at it, so 20 years ago, I think nobody was talking about clean cook stove, right? When it's Kirk Smith and WHO and others really documented, really painstakingly on those things, and then documented how much impact really because of that. Only then, policymakers at the global level started looking at more seriously. Now we have a global target. So I think, it's going to be fundamental that such a sort of work is going to be produced, and I will look forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at this point, we're going to wrap up. Oh, we have another question? I think, can we fit questions? Yeah, let's fit one more question in. We've got one back here.
No? Can I ask a question?
Oh.
No?
Oh, we have lots of questions. This is great. I'm seeing hands flying up everywhere. Please.
Is it okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to continue the discussion a little bit on the nexus of clean energy and health. I come to this meeting today from the public sector, having run the clean energy program in the state of New Jersey. And to date, the program is funded through the societal benefits charge, which we all pay as long as we're customers of the investor-owned utilities. And so that adds to the cost of energy. And the program itself has been investigating how we can attract private investment to advance clean energy in the state. And recently, last fall, at the Environmental Defense Funds and Citibank's financing forum, came up the discussion of the nexus of health and the benefits of clean energy. And I'm just wondering if any of you are seeing where the health industry is recognizing the benefits of clean energy and the reduction of the unhealthy impacts of fossil fuel-based energy, and if we're seeing any kind of investment or money coming into the pot from a health perspective to help finance the benefits that clean energy affords.
Can I take that one on just very quickly? I had the pleasure about 18 months ago of going to the World Health Organization's first Health and Climate Summit in Geneva. And there it was fascinating, going beyond energy access right now, just to see how, you can probably tell from my accent, I was born in the UK, despite 30 years outside. But there, one of the best presentations was actually from somebody from the National Health Service in the UK, where they have a small unit within that is looking at decarbonisation of the healthcare system across the whole of the country. And they've been working with private sector there to actually focus on some pretty innovative work, looking at not only sort of individual hospitals, but more throughout the whole healthcare sector, where they can be not only reducing the dependence on fossil fuels, but also bringing in some of the cleaner innovations. What was really great about that overall conference was that it was really recognizing for the first time, I would say, that health and climate go hand in hand. That yes, it's the particulates from the clean cooks, from the non-clean cook stoves, if you will, the black carbon that's produced, but it goes way beyond that as well. And I was listening to doctors saying, we realize that actually as physicians, we should not be allowing our hospitals, for example, to use diesel generators because of the emissions. How can we be, on the one hand, promoting a cleaner society, and on the other hand, not adopting the clean solutions that we recognize cause some of these asthma and other respiratory illnesses that we're seeing in the patients coming in the front door? So for me, that was a bit of an aha moment on the global stage to really hear that, yes, this is being taken up at the highest level in these global fora, and in fact, we hope now will be built out through the global goals, over time into a much more dynamic, both policy and set of implementation actions for the whole world.
And that's sort of what I was getting at, was the high rates of asthma among our children, and reduced productivity in the workforce. And so is there an opportunity to take funding that may have otherwise gone to sort of pure health issues, but recognizing the value in clean energy in addressing those health issues? So I think there's a wonderful nexus there, and I'm just wondering if we're seeing it explored at all.
Thank you very much. I think at this point, what I would like to do is sort of wrap this section of our panel. But we do have one more section to go where we will have the opportunity for more questions to come in, so please keep them coming. As we transition, I just wanted to thank all the panelists for speaking with me on these issues. I think they're fascinating. From someone who works in a slightly different part of the energy sector, but who is a female and has an inherent interest in this. This is really has been an enlightening conversation. So let's give them a round of applause now, and I will good job.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. As I said earlier, my name is Kathy Chen, and I'm a graduate student at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. So this round of questions I really want to ask from the student perspective on behalf of all the students who are here tonight. So I think, to say the least, all of you have made an incredible impact in the field of development, energy, and gender equality. So a lot of students here are very passionate about this topic, but I think what we struggle with is how to translate this passion into a meaningful career. So based on your experience in the work that you've already done and the work that still needs to be done, what would you recommend students getting involved with after they graduate? It's open to anyone.
Let's go down the line, maybe.
Okay.
You want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. So I spend a lot of time talking to students who are full of, and I mainly deal with Columbia students because that's where I teach. And I think, what I always advise is to really look into companies, people, organizations that are doing what you want to do, that resonate with you, rather than sending out from the SIPA career program, a gazillion CVs and cover letters. Because to me, it's a hard way to find a job. And what I think is more important is looking for that person or that organization that resonates with you. And you sort of, when you hear about it and you see it and you go, wow, I really want to do what that person is doing. And then you follow up with that person in a very personal, one-on-one way. And to me, that's the most effective, because it doesn't make sense to just get a job, because everyone I know who is at SIPA pretty much doesn't just want a job. They want a job that they love doing, that doesn't feel like work. And I think most of us are working in jobs that it doesn't feel like work. We love what we do. We have a passion for it. We're driven to do that. And I think it's out there for you to find that, but you're not going to find it in necessarily, applying to a million jobs and just hope that something works out. I think it's about really figuring out what that passion is that you have, and finding that person or organization. And in the words of my colleague Phil, who I teach with, Phil Laraco, he always says, you should stalk people, find them, go talk to them. Because you'll, I think, find most people in pretty much any job will be very open to helping you think through either a career path or a job opportunity and link you up and help you connect with who you need to connect with.
So I feel like we might all have pretty similar advice, so I'll skip the do what you're passionate about, because hopefully you are all going to follow that. So I'll say two things that are a bit contradictory, and one is I think that don't overthink it. That I think a lot of people coming out today, there's not a really clear path in development. There's not a clear training program where you do this and then that leads naturally to a specific career. So I think exactly finding a company or an organization that you feel passionately about, go work for them. That is going to open up a lot of other doors to other things if it turns out that wasn't the perfect fit, that I think you can transition relatively easily. The other very disconnected advice that I would give is I think some degree of specialization is useful. That I think when I was getting into this, it was a bit more of a new field, and there was more, just if you had general knowledge in energy or general knowledge in development, that was kind of an entree point. And I can say from me looking at a lot of CVs that come in from Power Africa, there's a lot of people that are general energy and development specialists, which is, we definitely have a need for a lot of people like that. But the people that catch our eye more are the ones who have really solid investment experience or really solid technical skills. So I think finding, if there is a track that you do have, I come from engineering, so I'm a little biased towards the technical side, but having something that's a really substantial technical skill, whether it's finance or actual engineering or technology, is something that I think is pretty distinctive at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to add to that, I mean, I am going to sound a little bit contradictory to Ellen, which I think she said exactly the right things. But also, if you don't nail it immediately, a career is actually a lot longer than you think it's going to be. So you actually have time to make changes. I'm not ancient, but you know, I kind of feel that I'm a little bit like a cat that's had 7 of my 9 lives, which is that I've done a lot of different things in my career, and having gone from my first starting out actually was not at all in this arena. I was helping heroin addicts who were trying to quit the drug in Hong Kong. So that was my first immediate postgraduate job for 2 years, which was kind of like a Peace Corps, and it taught me a lot of great skills in the Chinese language that I probably shouldn't mention in polite society. I learned how to tell the difference between I'm not very happy versus I'm gonna get you. But that really suffice it to say, which is that having gone from that and then leading nonprofits and then venture capital and policy, you have the time to make changes and make shifts. So Ellen, I think you said, or you said, don't overthink it. I think that's right. Which is, of course, you want to start out well. You want to be in a career in a sector that you care about. But sometimes the job market isn't always exactly where you want it to be. It's been very difficult. I've worked with a lot of recent graduates over the last number of years, who had to take internship after internship because the job market just wasn't there for them. I mean, they were doing the right things, but we also understand, those of us that have hired a lot of people, sometimes it's your passion shows through even if you're not quite there yet with what your job has taken you to. So hopefully, because you're all at this wonderful school called Columbia and doing this great SIPA program, you'll all get your dream careers immediately out of the gate. But if you don't, don't despair, because you have time.
Hear, hear. So I can't agree more. Actually, when people ask me, did you know what you wanted to do, or how did you plan, or what did you do? There was never a plan. I wish I could say that I really had the clear idea of where I was going, but I didn't. I mean, all of the factors that have been talked about so far kind of were part of my journey. And I think it's important to note that the journey is part of it. I mean, take that on, there's not a bad opportunity. And the diversity of what Rachel has done, I think we all have had some of that to a certain extent, and it enriches what we bring to each opportunity. One last point I would just say is you can also, so you're passionate about certain things. You can also be very thoughtful about, be your own thought leader. Where's the market going? What are the future trends that are happening? Where are we going to be in 20 years? You can start to take risks and be thinking, I'm going to see if I could get out in front of that. I mean, and if it intersects with something that you're interested in or passionate in, go with it. And you don't know. Maybe it's going to take you somewhere else. Who knows? But be your own thought leader as well.
Well, I don't have advice, but I can share my story. So I was studying on the nuclear engineering up to master's. And I was somehow lost because I think at that point I saw that, getting into the science and, getting an engineer and a career is that was my the goal when I went to the university. And then I was studying, doing a work at one of the Japanese premier, research institution on nuclear energy where I'm doing a master. So it was fabulous, and they gave me an offer as well. But then I didn't like it somehow, right? So then, I decided to do something completely different. Then I, applied for volunteer work, and then they sent me to Ghana to, teach in a secondary school in the village without anything to think. Now that experience led me to discover myself first. So I needed to discover myself first before I think about what to do next. And then, just in front of me as a fact, I saw people, I saw children, I saw darkness, all those things, but very lively culture, obviously, and the potentials out there. And that led me to think about, wow, this may be something that I can focus on. And I joined it, on the UN by coincidence, and then I just happened to go to the bookstore, and then thinking about, nothing, and then flip over the book, and then it just told me, oh, there's a a scheduled test going into the UN. Oh, I don't have anything to do right now. I just came back from Ghana. Let me try. And I happen to be here right now. So I'm a very well-planned person, and as you can see. But I think, something that came in front of me, then so when I saw that, that motivated me. So I discovered myself, and then somehow, something opportunity presented me to motivate myself. And then that drove me to certain thing. That's what I'm doing right now.
I can actually just second the getting out into the field. That I came out of mechanical engineering undergrad and took a year of wandering, and was absolutely how I figured out that I was not passionate about energy access in Africa before that year, and have been working on that since then.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing all your personal stories with us. So I want to bring this conversation to your respective organizations and talk about the kinds of initiatives that your organization is undertaking, either internally or externally, on encouraging more gender parity in terms of participation, empowering women in the workplace. A recent McKinsey study shows that by reducing the U.S. gender gap, we can increase GDP by an additional $4.3 trillion. So I want to put this question to all the panelists to kind of talk about what your respective organizations are working on right now.
Well, I can start for sure. I mean, Deloitte has certainly taken on diversity and inclusion in a very meaningful way. That I think we're seeing quite a trend in that direction in the private sector, certainly in Europe and the United States, but really all over the world. There's a lot of debate, I think, about the motivation behind that, what comes from it. Is it really enhancing financial performance? Is it really about the enhanced decision-making around, risk-based decision-making or otherwise, collaboration, and et cetera? But I think no matter what, or is it just the right thing to do? Is it from more of a fairness or an equity perspective? I think, all of these things are important, and whatever the motivation, I think it's increasingly part of our culture and the expectation of the rising talent that's coming, the millennial class, that this is what I want my organization to be. So at Deloitte, there was a real recognition about, I want to say 15 or 20 years ago, that certainly there was not gender parity, and where women were in the workforce, they were dropping out. And so they were dropping out maybe at the mid-level. And so there's a lot of soul searching around, why is that happening and what can we do about it? And so it's, we have a formal program called WIN, or Women's Initiative. And really it kind of, spans the spectrum of everything from mentorship relationships, and I would differentiate sponsorship relationships, where it's sort of different, where it's really somebody using their political capital to support you in your career advancement. Also looking at what kinds of programs does Deloitte as an institution need to offer to make it an environment that's conducive to work-life balance. We call it as flexibility and predictability, and it's certainly not a women's issue. It impacts men as much as women in our workplace, and allows for that to come overall. I've noticed a tremendous difference. Early on, it was a little bit more of the lip service, and like the paperwork was there, but it wasn't really put into practice. In the last 2 years, it's really been from the top leaders demonstrating, this is what you do, this is where we're unplugging, this is what when you take vacation time, this is what's expected, this is what you do to put the structure in place around you to have that be real, and all kinds of small details, but they come together to kind of form a cultural shift that's been very empowering.
I just wanted to add to that about sort of this idea of data and disaggregated data. And I mean, what you see in, for instance, in West Africa is organization, in those energy ministries, they're now being sort of forced to sort of look at women in all sorts of roles. It used to be that they would answer, yes, we have women in our organization, and that woman would be the woman bringing the tea for the meeting. Mm-hmm. And the question is like, well, that's, yeah, fine that she has that career path, but where are these women being put in jobs that will actually have a career trajectory, that woman would perhaps be, the energy minister someday. And I don't think that's so far off. And then, so I think it's about also just gathering that kind of data, because I don't think people necessarily understand, that you need to sort of, if you don't count people and you don't track it, then you can't really claim that you're really empowering women. It has to be in a clear role beyond, administrative level, but some sort of trajectory at entry level, mid-level, high level management. And in terms of these programs that companies do, what I find, because I'm on a STEM working group for a big private sector hiring headhunter firm, and the women who are part of that, they always talk about being at this high level and getting excellent leadership training, excellent management training. And I have to sort of say, like, no, that kind of training should be for the people in this room, the people who are graduating and going into these firms. Those are the ones that need the leadership training. Those are the ones that need the management training. But industry, I find, sort of sees it as a reward for doing well in the company, that all of a sudden they get this awesome opportunity to go off-site and be in this amazing place and really get inspired. But I'm always sort of the other sort of naysayer, or sort of at least trying to turn it on its head and saying, no, if you want to build the workforce from the ground up, it has to have that kind of training, whether it's leadership, negotiation, even technical or business training. It all has to happen with you guys coming into really awesome firms. And I think when you're looking for jobs, keep that in mind, is sort of look at the management culture, look at the culture of the company and say, is there a really good examples in their workforce, balance in terms of women and men, women at high places, that's probably a good sign. So maybe Deloitte is one of those places. I don't know, but that's just my perspective.
All right, so because we are running close to the end of this program, we will have one final round of Q&A. So feel free to ask any question you have, either about this panel session or the previous one. I see a hand over there.
Thank you. I had a question that was maybe more for Power Africa, but could be also related to others. I was wondering to what level you implicated the local authorities and local population, and also, for example, if you install an off-grid power structure in a village, how do you maintain the longevity of it all when maybe the knowledge isn't there at the local level to do maintenance and that type of work?
Both great questions. I think the outreach to civil society and outreach to local groups is something that we're ramping up. I think that it's something where we've been engaged. Reactive sounds controversial, but it's not. It's more been where we've had touch points and we've worked with them. I think we could be doing a lot more to leverage the amazing networks that they have and have much more local involvement. I do want to say that most of Power Africa does, we do most of our projects through partners. So for any projects, a large grid project that's funded by, say, the World Bank is involved, or African Development Bank, or anyone who's signed on to the IFC performance standards, that includes a lot of local engagement. So it's not necessarily us doing it, but it is something we look for in projects. And on the question of sustainability with the off-grid projects, this is, again, where it helps be working through private sector, because for years there were a lot of off-grid projects that didn't have that maintenance rolled in, and the system was installed and then someone walked away. But that wasn't a business. That was more of a donor project, and there wasn't that motivation to make sure that the community was trained. And I think what we're seeing with the off-grid companies, because it is their business, they can't walk away, because maybe they'll sell products now, but 2 years from now, no one will buy their products because they won't work. And I think we're seeing the companies that are having the most success are really, really invested in their contact with their customers, that it's not about just selling and walking away. It's, if you go to some of the companies that are working in Kenya and Tanzania, they have call centers where they're constantly talking to their customers and talking them through, you know what you've signed up for, these are the financing payments, is anything wrong with your system? They have 24-hour service. And so I think that really, there's been a transition away from that, leave it and assume everything's going to work out, to really a customer-oriented model.
Can I just add on that? I mean, I think Kate's absolutely right, and I'm on the board of a solar company in India that Ellen knows very well as well, that I would say has been exemplary in that, in really building out service centers so that every customer can either get a in-person service or can get attention within 24 to 48 hours. And this is a solar company that's working out of Bangalore, but in some very remote areas of Karnataka state. So, in areas with low population density. So it's pretty difficult to get to some of these places, but they have that pledge. And I would definitely say that's going to be a differentiator to good companies in the future, is those that really are able to service. But there's a policy aspect in that as well, which is when you're putting your incentives in place, from a policy perspective, make sure you're not only incentivizing the installation of the solution, but you're actually incentivizing the maintenance of that solution as well. And then the other aspect I would say of that as well is that we've really seen a need to build out the ecosystem, which is investing in the workforce development as well. I've been in a number of vocational training institutes that do have some kind of renewable energy training program. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. I would say almost all of them across sub-Saharan Africa are very much underfinanced, not necessarily teaching the skills that I would personally consider to be cutting edge in the sector. So you have this mismatch between what the graduates are coming out of those institutes with, even if there is an industry there, what are the skills that they're looking for? So it really needs to be this close alignment between the educational side, the ministries of education, working with the private sector in making sure that those that are being trained are coming out with the skills that industry really needs as well.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for talking to us. I have a question actually for someone if is working in a different sector. Like myself is an auditor in an investment bank. So for someone like me, that I feel I'm very passionate about the topic about clean energy and how we can get into the sector and maybe make a bigger impact, like improve people's well-being, reduce pollution. Like, what are the resources that is accessible, like for people like me that have a full-time job but also want to at least learn a little bit more about the topic, equip myself a little bit to make a informed decision without like just quitting my job, jump into the field, try to build a career out of it. Like, what are the available resources and what are the advices that you could give us? Thank you.
Well, first up, you came to this panel. That was an excellent choice. But I think that there is a lot of information. Maybe it's self-serving to say Google, but there's a lot of information that is available, and I would definitely recommend trying to get a background before you start having those conversations. But I think we can point to Sustainable Energy for All. There's great work coming out of Deloitte, from UN Foundation, from everyone who's up here from Columbia, as well as the World Bank, that is really we'll have more information than you can possibly digest, but I think it's out there.
Yeah, and I think building off of that, there's a lot of free webinars and various, not just panel events, but even or low-cost programs, especially out of the World Bank, that are really quite rigorous and meaningful. They're sort of online, but I've done it myself, so it's very, they really hold you to it. I would assume that, there might be other kinds of extension programs, I'm not sure, at Columbia or otherwise, that maybe there's others, but there's a tremendous amount of resources out there and available now.
Well, I would just go one step further as well and say, first of all, one of the things that I set up at the UN Foundation was this practitioner network of what's now become 2,300 members, a lot of which are energy enterprises, from the very big to the very small, including a lot of startup and early stage companies. And I would say almost without exception, their financials need improvement. So if you're coming from the financial side, there's a lot of opportunities to volunteer. It's not quitting your day job, but volunteer. They need advisors, they need board members, they need volunteers. So there's a lot of companies that could use your expertise in finance.
I just wanted to add a personal story. One of my students, she was super passionate about this field, but coming out of Columbia, there's a lot of student debt, so people generally have a difficult time trying to navigate jumping into development, which is not necessarily a super lucrative field. Anyway, so she lived in New York, and she was working for a fairly large energy company. However, on her weekends and nights, she was working with me on development projects, and so she was really interested in doing that, and that's where her real passion was, but she knew she had this sort of reality of like, oh my God, I just graduated from Columbia and I need to make sure that I'm financially stable first. So fast forward, she did this amazing job at her day job, then she was working on energy and development and energy enterprise development with me, and then she just left one day and she became a co-founder of a really interesting investment firm that focuses on solar in Africa, in East Africa. So she is now the co-founder of this amazing investment firm in East Africa. But it took that moment of sort of recognizing what the reality was of what she needed to do day to day immediately after graduation, following her passion by working on the side, and then eventually jumping into this other thing. The other thing I would mention is if you're interested in sort of real on-the-ground work here in the New York area, there's an amazing organization called Grid Alternatives. And they do solar installations in poor communities in the New York area. So they're always looking for interesting, committed people to just learn how to do a solar install, and you'll meet all kinds of very interesting people as a volunteer on a Saturday.
So make sure you get Ellen's business card after this event. Any other questions? We'll take one more. Annie River?
It's good to get one mail question.
Yeah. Equal time, right, Minoru?
So my question's more about, I guess it's more South Asia and microfinance centric, in the sense that cultural barriers play a large part in expanding access to, say, clean energy or efficient cook stoves. So in a country, say, like India, with where the microfinance clients need the husband's permission at times to actually go ahead with a loan for income generation, which is easier because you can justify it by having a steady income stream coming in. But doing that for, say, an efficient cook stove, for which the husband doesn't realize what his wife has to go through while cooking every day, or even with solar lanterns if she needs to use it to go to a field to, for whatever work she might be doing. So what kind of initiatives are being done in that case to tackle these cultural barriers and actually maybe educate the men as to why these products are important and they should be providing support to their wives and helping them get these?
I think, to be honest, the buying decision, typically what you find, at least for an energy product linked with microfinance, is it's a buying decision that the family makes together. So yeah, there is this discord perhaps between the father and the mom, but in general, those kind of buying decisions need to happen at the sort of, in a unified front as best you can. The other thing I would mention is microfinance for energy is not happening so much. It's not an easy thing for a lot of reasons in terms of the perceived risk related to the energy technology. The term doesn't match up with a typical microfinance loan. And so what we've seen in the space is there's something called pay-as-you-go systems. And that's really circumventing microfinance in a major way because it's allowing people to use the technology that they have already for payment systems in their phone linked directly to their bank account. So pay-as-you-go for solar, for cook stoves is huge now, and it was pioneered really in East Africa. Now it's everywhere. And so that allows you to essentially do microfinance. You pay in increments, and then over time, then you get the product. So I would say microfinance and energy is something which seems, in theory, to be a no-brainer, but it's super difficult also because the microfinance institution isn't necessarily so keen on changing their business model at all to adapt to energy. They're doing very well financially with their current portfolio. So adding something that they don't really understand in terms of energy, and also it's a bit more complicated because you have service and maintenance. So the alternative that's happened, in the last 5 and 10 years is pay-as-you-go systems.
Yeah, I would also add for Selco, which doesn't use pay-as-you-go, that they generally use livelihoods as their entry point. That they do a lot of work with households, but they're always coming at it from the livelihoods perspective. So it depends whether they're looking, it's not really gender disaggregated there, it's just looking at the livelihood. So they have found over their 20-year life, they've really been one of the pioneers in the sector, that the income of the families that they work with tends to increase by 10 to 15% as a result of getting the solar. So in terms of the gender side, inside the house, what I hear is that maybe there might be a slight difference about where the light is positioned within the house. But generally, is it closer to the kitchen? If they're only using one in the hallway, who gets more light? But generally, they're coming in more looking at the livelihoods and where they can make the greatest difference with livelihood. And that can be a man, it can be a woman.
Wrapped up? Yeah. We gotta go catch train. Okay. All right, so sorry about that. We're out of time. I want to say thank you to everyone who came out tonight. We will be posting the live recording of this video on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. So I want to thank all our sponsors, partners, and volunteers today for making this event happen. And I want to invite all of you to give our amazing panelists a warm round of applause.